Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is May 25th. Today in garden history, we celebrate the birthday of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American transcendentalist, essayist, philosopher, and poet, and he was born on this day, May 25th in 1803. After he graduated from Harvard, Ralph decided to go by his middle name of Waldo. He was beloved by his fellow Harvard classmates, and many of those students became his lifelong friends. Waldo served as his class poet. 6 years later, on Christmas Day, Waldo met his first wife, Ellen. 2 years later, he lost her to tuberculosis. Her death eventually made him a wealthy man, although Waldo had to sue his in-laws to get his inheritance. After losing Ellen, Waldo traveled to Europe, and there he visited the Royal Botanic Garden while he was in Paris. The experience was a revelation to him, and it was there that Waldo began to see connections between different plant species thanks to the natural way that Jussieu had organized the garden. The American historian and biographer Robert D. Richardson wrote about this period of heightened awareness for Waldo. He wrote, Emerson's moment of insight into the interconnectedness of things in the Royal Garden of Paris was a moment of almost visionary intensity that pointed him away from theology and toward science. When he returned to the States, Waldo became friends with other forward thinkers and writers of his time, like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Thomas Carlyle. In 1835, Waldo married again. His second wife was named Lydia Jackson. Waldo changed her name to Lydian, and he also had many pet names for her, like Queenie or Asia. But she always called him Mr. Emerson. Around that time, Waldo began to think differently about the world in general, and his perspective on life changed as well. As the son of a minister, his move away from religion and societal beliefs was quite impressive. In 1836, Waldo published his Philosophy of Transcendentalism in an essay that he titled Nature. In this master work, Waldo wrote, "Nature is a language, and every new fact one learns is a new word. I wish to learn this language, not that I may know a new grammar, but that I may read the great book that is written in that tongue." Waldo also advised, "Adopt the pace of nature. Her secret is patience." As Waldo grew older, he greatly enjoyed gardening. His time in the garden also proved revelatory. As a young man, Waldo had hired workers to help him in the landscape. As a mature man, he recognized the benefits of exercise and a feeling of satisfaction from doing garden work all by himself. Waldo wrote, "When I go into the garden with a spade and dig a bed, I feel such an exhilaration and good health that I discover that I have been defrauding myself all this time in letting others do for me what I should have done with my own hands." Waldo also quipped, "All my hurts, my garden spade can heal." In the twilight of his life, Ralph Waldo Emerson was invited to join a group of 9 intellectuals on a camping trip in the Adirondacks. The trip had one mission: to connect with nature. Waldo's traveling companions included Harvard's naturalist Louis Agassiz, the great botanist James Russell Lowell, and the American naturalist Jeffrey Wyman. They had a marvelous time. It was Ralph Waldo Emerson who wrote, "The landscape belongs to the person who looks at it." And another Waldo quote is a personal favorite of mine: "The earth laughs in flowers." Finally, here's a little prayer that Waldo wrote to thank for all the gifts of nature. For flowers that bloom about our feet, for tender grass, so fresh, so sweet, for song of bird and hum of bee, for all things fair we hear or see. Father in heaven, we thank thee. And it was on this day, May 25th in 1909, that Miss Amanda Palmer, a teacher at Wilmington Normal School in Wilmington, North Carolina, shared her experience of taking her students on nature-based field trips, and her report was published in the Atlantic Educational Journal. Amanda wrote, "On a field trip, a pupil gains more of life's lessons than could possibly be learned in the schoolroom. These trips lead the children to ask questions which the teacher must answer. My class is composed of children in the 4th year primary. On one trip, trees of the neighborhood were studied. The flowers commanded our attention on still another trip. Flowers like the wild carrot, the yarrow, and wild mustard were examined. On one occasion, a great mullein, or velvet dock, was brought into school. It was greatly admired by the children, and on the next field trip, no child had to be told what a mullein was. They themselves each saw and knew the mullein. On one trip, we looked for birds especially, using field glasses. After hearing and seeing many birds, we sat down about 6 o'clock in the evening to listen to the concert, not one for which we were forced to give a silver offering, but a concert free to all. It was the sweetest music ever heard." On May 25th, 1909, we either saw or heard these birds: a phoebe, a pewee, a flicker, a cuckoo, a black and white warbler, a magnolia warbler, a chestnut-sided warbler, a water thrush, a Maryland yellowthroat, a redstart, a catbird, a brown thrasher, a Carolina wren, and a hermit thrush. I think it is very instructive to show children the various birds' nests. They have observed with keenest wonder the blackbird's nest, the swinging nest of the oriole, the mud-lined nest of the robin, the feather-lined nest of the plain English sparrow, and the horsehair-lined nest of the red-eyed vireo. And then Amanda ends with this recommendation: the following nature books are helpful and interesting: the Audubon leaflets, the Home Nature Study Library, and Julia Rogers' Among Green Trees. And incidentally, there is a free digitalized copy of that book that was just mentioned, Julia Rogers' Among Green Trees. It's available online, and I put a link to it in today's show notes if you'd like to check it out. Wilmington Normal School, where Amanda taught, was the first school in Wilmington, North Carolina, to admit African American students. The school operated from 1868 to 1921. And it was on this day, May 25th in 1939, that the English novelist, essayist, journalist, and critic George Orwell wrote that his hens had laid 200 eggs in the previous 2 weeks. When George returned to his home in Wallington after the Spanish Civil War, he recorded the activity of his chickens as he recovered from his war injuries and another bout of lung issues. George noted everything about his chickens: their daily egg production, their behavior, and what they ate and required in terms of care. George started his diary 3 years after arriving at Wallington, and he began it on a day in April with these words: "We have now 26 hens. Yesterday, 7 eggs. The hens have only recently started laying again. Everything greatly neglected, full of weeds, ground very hard and dry, attributed to heavy falls of rain, then no rain at all for some weeks." And then he gives a list of flowers in bloom in the garden: polyanthus, sabretia, scilla, grape hyacinth, oxalis, and a few narcissi. He writes, "Many daffodils in the field, These are very double and evidently not real wild daffodil, but bulbs dropped there by accident. Bullaces and plums coming into blossom, apple trees budding, but no blossom yet, pears in full blossom, roses sprouting fairly strongly. Well, there you go. A little update from George Orwell about his garden over 90 years ago. And before I forget, there is a fabulous book from last year, from 2021, and it's called Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit. And when it debuted, it received all kinds of critical acclaim. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, and the writer Margaret Atwood raved that it was an exhilarating romp through Orwell's life and times, and also the life and times of roses. And Harper's Magazine said that it was a captivating account of Orwell as a gardener, a lover, a parent, and an endlessly curious thinker. And then the publisher wrote this about the book. Again, it's called Orwell's Roses. I put a link to it in today's show notes. It's by the wonderful Rebecca Solnit, and used copies run around $20. But here's what the publisher wrote. In the spring of 1936, a writer planted roses. So begins Rebecca Solnit's new book, a reflection on George Orwell's passionate gardening and the way that his involvement with plants, particularly flowers, illuminates his other commitments as a writer and anti-fascist, and on the intertwined politics of nature and power. Great book. And it was on this day in 1988, May 25th, that the Ripley Garden at the Smithsonian was dedicated. Tucked between the Arts and Industries Building and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, the Ripley Garden is home to rare and unusual trees and shrubs, as well as annuals and perennials, many of which are in elevated beds, which is wonderful for folks of all different abilities and also for little children. It gets the garden up to eye level, and it's wonderful for people like me with rheumatoid arthritis or arthritis in general, because you don't have to stoop over to see the flowers. It's all brought up to at least waist level, and you can examine many of the specimens very closely. And I also just want to say that this garden is immaculately maintained, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But this garden was the inspiration of Mary Livingston Ripley. She was a lifelong plant collector, gardener, and wife of the Smithsonian's 8th secretary, Dillon Ripley. Mary came up with the idea for a fragrant garden in this location. It was slated to become a parking lot, but in 1978, she rallied the Women's Committee of the Smithsonian Associates to support the garden. Now, that group was an organization that Mary founded back in 1966, and it was established to raise money for Smithsonian projects. 10 years later, on this day, May 25th in 1988, the Women's Committee recognized their founder and friend, Mary Livingston Ripley, by naming the garden in her honor. And in 1996, Mary Livingston Ripley's obituary shared some fascinating details about her life. They wrote, during the 20 years that her husband worked at the Smithsonian, Mary frequently accompanied him on scientific expeditions all over the world, but especially to exotic reaches throughout the Far East. She also volunteered her time to fundraising and gardening exhibits at the museum. And Mary was an avid gardener herself. She gardened at both of her homes in Washington and in Litchfield, Connecticut. Mary was also the person behind the Smithsonian's huge collection of orchids, little known fact there, and she was also adept at skinning birds and turning over rocks in search of insects. And today there is a lovely woman named Janet Draper. She is the horticulturist for the Mary Livingston Ripley Garden. It's a position that Janet has relished since 1997, and you can see her work on the Smithsonian Gardens Twitter feed. It's one of my favorite feeds. I love seeing all of their posts and what is going on in that garden, especially after getting a chance to see it firsthand myself. It's a beautiful space, very impressive. So check that out. You can head on over to Twitter. You can find my feed there as well. And also, I am a friend of Janet's on Facebook. So the benefit of that is that I get to see all of her personal posts about the incredible flowers and the rare specimens that are planted in that garden. I know I got a ton of ideas when I passed through there a few years ago. It's just absolutely astounding. And by the way, Janet is a wonderful person. I got to meet her at the Garden Bloggers Fling back in DC a number of years ago. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention her. She is wonderful and so dedicated. Janet Draper, for her dedication to the fabulous Ripley Garden, named in honor of Mary Livingston Ripley. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Potted History by Catherine Horwood. This book came out in 2021. It's one of my favorites. This is a revised edition, and the subtitle is called How Houseplants Took Over Our Homes. Great little history, great little garden history book here, and it's all about houseplants. Now, houseplants are crazy popular, and that's one of the reasons why Catherine revised this book. It was over a decade ago when the first edition came out, and so this is the second edition, and as Catherine mentions, a surprising amount has changed in the story of plants in the home since this book first appeared. Now, what has caused this massive expansion in popularity? Well, in addition to the pandemic, which of course turned so many people toward gardening and also toward growing houseplants, that trend had already started, but was definitely nudged along by the pandemic, there are a couple of things, three things, that Catherine believes have contributed to this overwhelming demand for houseplants. So she says, first, there is improved propagation techniques leading to increased availability and lower prices. And that is just fantastic. I know for me personally, our local Hy-Vee, our grocery store, has a wonderful floral section. And in fact, I find it quite interesting that the houseplant area is right on the east entrance of my store. That's the side that I always like to go in, of course, because the houseplants are there. But I am completely fascinated by the fact that houseplants are now impulse buys, because that's why they're at the front of the store. So while there are cut flowers that are offered, they are not right by the entrance. They're a little further in. And it's all of the houseplants, all of these incredible houseplants. I can't believe how wonderfully healthy they all look and how affordable they are. And they're right there in my grocery store. So just crazy. And so Catherine is just spot on with identifying this trend. And then the other two factors that she mentions are the changing lifestyles, particularly of millennials. They are definitely into houseplants. I know when I took my daughter to college this past fall, her roommate took up half of the windowsill with her houseplants, and then my daughter's houseplants took up the other half of the windowsill. But as a wise gardener, knowing that my daughter's room was facing north and that she would not care for these houseplants, 0.9% of Emma's plants were all permanent stems. They were fake. But I did have two super tough plants there. One of them actually was some moss that I had growing in a closed terrarium environment. So Emma never needed to do a thing, and it just was happy as can be there. So yes, I am a gardener, and yes, I love houseplants, but I'm also a realist as well. All right, and then the other factor is the phenomenal growth of houseplants on social media. You know, just the other day, I saw someone post on Twitter a picture of their living room, I'm assuming, and it was filled with houseplants. And somewhere in the back of this jungle, you could just see one lone chair. And the caption was, "Is this too many houseplants?" And even I was like, yes, that is too many houseplants. That's crazy. But there is no doubt that social media has encouraged this trend of houseplants and bringing plants indoors and turning your home into a bit of a conservatory. Now, I have to confess that my copy of Catherine's book, I am so bummed out, I left it at home. It's in my garden library back in Maple Grove, right beside my favorite chair, and I like to have Catherine's book on top of my stack of books because I think it looks great because there's all these houseplants in the area. So the book is perfectly on topic for the vibe that I have going on in that little area of the library. So I love that. So I am having to read to you from the little snippet that's on Amazon here. And I'm so bummed out by that because I had a few pages that were dog-eared that I wanted to share with you. But that's okay. We'll get through this just fine. Catherine starts out in the introduction talking about a man named Sir Hugh Platt. He was a garden writer, and he published one of the first books on gardening techniques. And he was also the first person to write a little section about having a garden, he said, within doors. So there's your little garden history for you, Sir Hugh Platt. And you know, he would have loved this idea house that I saw a couple of years ago. And this was a house that was sponsored by one of our local nurseries. They own it and they update it in the spring and the fall with all of these wonderful decor ideas. And for this particular year, I think this was a spring idea home, if I remember correctly. What they did is they took one of the bedrooms upstairs and they turned it into an indoor potting shed. Fantastic idea. I know what you're thinking. How can this possibly work? But they had a little bathroom next door to this. So that worked out great for when you needed to wash your hands or water some plants. But then this little potting bench that they'd put in the middle of the room ended up being so cute. And then they repurposed a bookshelf and had it be basically their system for organizing all of their garden paraphernalia, their garden books, all of their garden supplies, whether it's soil or soil toppers or different stones that they might put in a terrarium. There was a beautiful display of different containers and pots and tons of terracotta, which made me go bananas for the room. But anyway, what a wonderful idea. And so if you are loving this craze of indoor houseplants, you're going to love Catherine's book. It's full of houseplant history, the stories of some of our most beloved houseplants. And what better time of year to read about houseplants than right now this week when all of us are starting to get ready to move our houseplants back outside so they can spend the summer outdoors where they'll be deliriously happy before they have to come back in for the winter. So just a fantastic book. And I also just want to quickly say that if you are giving someone the gift of a houseplant, then by all means, order a few copies of Catherine's book and then include that along with the gift. Talk about amping up the gift a little bit and just showing that extra little bit of thoughtfulness. This is such a great book. And it's a little book. It reminds me of kind of like a little paperback. It's not very big, which is why I love it by the chair in my garden library. It's not overwhelming. It's such a pleasant little cover. It's beautifully illustrated with just a single little houseplant. And it is just so stinking cute. It's called Potted History, and it's 176 pages of houseplant history. So who wouldn't love that? You can get a copy of Potted History by Catherine Horwood and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $8. So great deal and cute, cute, cute little book. All right, we end the show today with a botanic spark from one of my favorite garden writers, Louisa Yeomans King. It was on this day, May 25th in 1905, that Louisa wrote in her diary, and she recorded it in the book, The Flower Garden Day by Day. And she wrote this charming little entry about lilacs, and it's kind of funny. She writes, May 25th, species lilacs are wonderfully interesting. If there is room, get a few of these. If there is no room, get one or two. And if there is room for but one, get Syringa Zwegenzawi superba, or Syringa ablata for its crimson leaves in October, the only lilac to color so. Isn't that fantastic? And if you'd like to work on a little tongue twister with your kids or just for yourself, you can practice saying Syringa Zwegenzawi superba. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Gardener. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. And don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.